Hey everybody, here we are for Chapter 5, Section 2. We're going to talk about the cycling of matter. Nutrients going back into the soil, back into the bodies, etc. Cycling. We'll look at several different cycles as we go, but your essential question is explain how the excess use of fertilizer can affect the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles. Something to think about as we move through today's lesson. Right off the bat, let's talk about carbon cycle. Now this is one you should be fairly familiar with. You should have talked about it when you did life science, talked about living things, plants, animals, etc. But let's go ahead and break it down. This is the movement of carbon from the non-living environment, whether it's in the air, the soil, the rocks, etc., into living things and then back into the environment. Carbon is the essential component of proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. This is what makes up all organisms. You are a carbon-based life form. The trees are a carbon-based life form. Grass is a carbon-based life form. All life as we know it here on planet Earth is carbon-based. We're made up of complex hydrocarbon chains, and we find it in everything that either is alive or was, like in our fossil fuels. Coal and oil came from living organisms, and it's the hydrocarbon chains that we use for fuel, etc. They're all part of this carbon cycle. I'm going to put the picture of the generic carbon cycle up there behind us, and let's take a look at these key components. Well, carbon exists in the air, carbon dioxide that we breathe in. It is in water, it dissolves in water, and it's also in living organisms like you and me. Producers, things like plants, protists, algae, things that produce their own food, autotrophs, if you will, convert carbon dioxide in the atmosphere into carbohydrates during photosynthesis. We're taking carbon dioxide, specifically water, H2O, turning it into sugars inside of their cells, using chloroplasts to make like C6H12O6, a simple sugar, during photosynthesis. Consumers, like you and like me, obtain our carbon from the carbohydrates in the producers we eat. So in the form of carbohydrate sugars, proteins, or fats, these are all part of this carbon cycle, if you will. During cellular respiration, some of that carbon dioxide is released back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. So we eat the carbons, and as our body breaks it down into energy, adenine triphosphate, or ATP, then we release the carbon dioxide back out. We're breathing carbon dioxide into the air, plants are taking it out, we're eating the plants, putting it back in, cycles round and round. Now also, this carbon winds up getting stored in what we call sinks. A sink is just an area that you can put something. It holds water, typically in our kitchen, but we'll refer to things as a sink, something that stores something. Well, limestone is an example. Limestone is basically like calcium carbonate, and carbon is formed in it. In the making of limestone, it has carbon in it. So limestone, right under our feet here in Florida, Kentucky is also largely limestone in its karst, its topography underneath it. This is a sink of carbon. It sits in it, it stays there. Our forests are largely carbon sinks. They're taking carbon dioxide out of the air, and it's being stored in the trunks of the trees, the leaves, etc. So all these things we can refer to as a carbon sink, but limestone forms one of the largest carbon sinks that we have on Earth. Now, carbon that is stored in the bodies of organisms like you and me, and fat or oils, other molecules, these can be released into the soil as well when we die. So when either we die or a tree dies or even a blade of grass dies, the carbons that are stored in those things get released back into the atmosphere. Either they go down into the soil or released up as carbon dioxide again. These molecules can form deposits of coal if it's plant matter. They can form deposits of oil if it's animal matter, living things, and natural gas. And this is what we refer to as fossil fuels. So fossil fuels are also carbon sinks, places where carbon is stored until we burn and release them back into the atmosphere, back into the cycle. Fossil fuels store all of this from the leftover bodies of organisms, whether it's plants for coal or animals for oil, that died millions of years ago. They died, the oil seeped down into the ground, it cooled up, and under the heat and pressure turns into the crude oil, coal, or natural gas that you and I are currently using to fuel either our electricity, typically by burning coal, or our cars, trucks, trains by burning oil, gasoline. Now, humans affect the carbon cycle. All of this is really review, kind of from stuff we talked about in the last chapter, things that we've touched base on. So let's just run through it really quick. Now, humans, you and I, we are burning fossil fuels, whether it's gasoline in our car, our lawnmowers, or whether it's coal for the electricity that we need all around us, lights, air conditioning, turning my computer on, what have you. These increased levels of carbon dioxide, the more coal we burn, the more we're taking it out of the sink and releasing it back into the atmosphere. This is what is leading towards climate change. More greenhouse gases in the air capture and re-radiate the heat that the sun puts on the planet, and the planet gets a little bit warmer, a little bit warmer. Now, the greenhouse effect is a good thing, but my mom is famous for saying too much of a good thing can be, yeah, a bad thing. So we need the greenhouse effect, we just don't want too much. Carbon dioxide is this greenhouse gas along with water vapor, methane, and nitrous oxides. These are the four big ones that we will come back to over and over. And all of these gases absorb and re-radiate the heat. So the heat goes up, but it catches these molecules and they hold on to it. Then as it cools off, they re-radiate the heat back out into the atmosphere, keeping us warmer than we would be without them. Let's move into the nitrogen cycle. Process where nitrogen is circulating amongst the air, the soil, the plants, and animals within any individual ecosystem. Now, all organisms need nitrogen in order to build proteins, like our deoxyribonucleic acid. We need the nitrogen in order to build these complex carbohydrates, complex proteins, and these complex nucleic acids. Nitrogen makes up 78% of the air we breathe. Every breath you take in, 78% of that is nitrogen, and about 20% is oxygen, somewhere between 20 and 21, leaving about 1% for all the rest of the stuff. And argon makes up a big chunk of that. Nitrogen is a huge part of what we are breathing. For the nitrogen to get used by most organisms, plants need it, you and I need it. But before you and I can get it, we're consumers, we gotta eat it in a plant or other animal. So how do they get it? Well, it has to be altered, it has to be fixed. The nitrogen in the air, most things can't use it. It's just there, sitting there. However, there are a few species of bacteria known as nitrogen-fixing bacteria, ta-da, that can actually turn atmospheric nitrogen into the nitrates that are needed in the soil for plants to pull out of it. So they fix the atmospheric nitrogen into chemical compounds, typically nitrates, nitrites, that can be used by other organisms. So it is these nitrogen-fixing bacteria that take nitrogen out of the air, fix it into the soil so that the plants can pull it out. Plants pull it out and use it, and then we eat the plants, or we eat the animals that eat the plants, and that's how you and I, as consumers, get our nitrogen. So looking at the picture up here, we have the different things. Those nitrogen-fixing bacteria are kind of key. They're down there in the ground, and they're turning it into what the plants can use, and ultimately as the plants and you and I die, that it can make its way back into the atmosphere. So they convert it into ammonia, NH4, ammonia, the N nitrogen part, H4, ammonia, plants pull that up, or into nitrates as well. They live in nodules, typically in the roots of certain plants. It's bacteria, but they tend to live in the nodules, just like we have bacteria living in our guts, right? Our intestines. Now these types of plants, typically legumes like peanuts, beans, etc. Clover, interestingly enough, is a big one. We have clover all over the place. That's where they live, and they're taking the nitrogen, putting it into the soil. Now they use the sugar provided by the legumes that are there in the root structures to produce the compounds like the ammonia or the nitrates, puts it in the soil, which other organisms can use. Excess nitrogen that is fixed by them, they're using some of it, and then others are going into the soil, and that's what different things are taking up into their root system, and then converting it into the complex carbohydrates, proteins, and deoxyribonucleic acid, our RNA, DNA in our bodies. So the nitrogen then gets stored in you and me. It's in the trees, it's in the plants, it's in everything, it's in the air, and it's stored there until we die. Once I die, then my body goes back into the ground, and the nitrates are able to be broken down by other animals, our decomposers. They're going to break it down into waste that other animals can use, plants typically, and then animals can eat the plants. These decomposers return the nitrogen to the soil, and bacteria take over again. There's a different species. Some species of bacteria are nitrogen fixers, and others turn it back into nitrogen gas. So as we die, then other bacteria decompose our bodies and break us down into our component parts, and the nitrogen gas gets re-released back into the atmosphere, and the cycle can continue. Bacteria take it out of the air, put it into the soil. Plants take it out of the soil. You and I eat it. Our bodies die. Different bacteria put it back into an atmospheric gaseous state, back into the atmosphere. Now, lightning also can fix nitrogen into the soil. There's just not enough lightning strikes for it to be a major part of it, but it does contribute. Now, moving on to the very exciting phosphorus cycle. Phosphorus is a little bit different. The carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, they both have an atmospheric element to them. However, and like the water cycle, if we wanted to talk water cycle, they all have its water vapor, its nitrogen at some point, carbon dioxide is a gas at some point. They're all a gas at some point except phosphorus. It's always in a solid state. Now it might be dissolved in water, but it's never in a gaseous state. So phosphorus. Many molecules need phosphorus. Once again, we're made up of complex chains of hydrocarbons. Carbon and hydrogen is the base, but it'll have a random nitrogen attached here, or a random phosphorus attached here, or a manganese, or a magnesium. There'll be trace elements in all of this stuff, and phosphorus is one of the very needed ones that are there. It's in the cells of almost every living thing, small amounts of phosphorus. Plants get it, once again, from the soil and the water. Phosphorus will get dissolved in water, so as the plant's taking the water up, it's pulling whatever else is dissolved in the water, whether it's pollution, impurities, or things like iron, zinc, and phosphorus that might be dissolved in the water. It gets pulled into the plant. They make use of what they can, and otherwise they just absorb the other pollutants. If it's not too much, it doesn't kill them, and they remove pollutants from the ground this way. Too much pollutants can cause the tree or plant, etc., to die. Anyway, back to phosphorus. Pulling phosphorus up out of the water or out of the soil, pulling it up into the plant, and then it's used by the plant in its growth and development as it makes its deoxyribo or ribonucleic acids, as long as other molecules within the plant. Animals are then getting our phosphorus how? We're consumers. We're consuming. We're eating the plants, and or we're eating the plants that have the phosphorus, or we're eating the animals that ate the plants that have the phosphorus, one way or the other, typically. And the phosphorus cycle is just this cyclic movement of phosphorus from the environment into the organisms, into other organisms until we die, and it goes back down into the soil by and large. So the picture up here, we're just looking at this generic. Keep in mind here, showing the rain, phosphorus is never in the atmosphere, but the rain caused weathering of rocks, and phosphorus is found in rocks. So as rocks break apart, it can release the phosphorus that way. So don't be thrown off by the picture of the rain. They're just showing the weathering of rocks as part of this cycle. So one of the big ways it does get in is when the soil and water, when the rocks erode. Small amounts of phosphorus can dissolve into a phosphate, and that then moves into the soil, into the water, the groundwater, etc. And plants absorb these phosphates in the soil through the roots. Now, this is where that essential question is kicking in. When you go to Lowe's or wherever it is, the feed and seed store, and you want to get some fertilizer, maybe you want your plants in your garden to grow, maybe you're going to fertilize your lawn to get it to grow, whatever reason. The main ingredients in that are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. These are the three main ingredients. So all plants, in order to be healthy, need nitrogen, they need phosphorus, and then potassium. So we're going to talk about those too, nitrogen and phosphorus. So they're needed for plants to grow, and it comes out of the rocks. But then when we throw fertilizer out into the ground, well, we're adding phosphorus or nitrogen in a way that the plants can get. So it's all part of this cycle, but fertilizer we're manufacturing in a lab. It's not part of just the natural cycle of things. Because of something like farming, we keep taking nutrients out of the soil, and then we're selling the corn off over there somewhere. The corn's not going back into the soil. So we keep taking nutrients out, and in some shape, form, or fashion, we got to put them back in. So phosphorus, the plants absorb it through the soil, take it up into the plant itself, then something eats the plant, and that phosphorus can walk away from that system. But rocks are the way that it gets put back in. Typically as rocks break up, weather, get apart, they dissolve out. Now, a lot of times when these phosphates get into the soil or into the water supply, because they'll just wash off into the rivers, down into the ocean, etc., a lot of these phosphate salts are not soluble in water. They stay particles, so they just sink to the bottom. So a lot of times they just sink to the bottom and they accumulate as sediment. Now, after a long time, the rock cycle, etc., these sediments may become sedimentary rock, and if it gets redistributed back up to the surface, then the phosphates can go back into the cycle. But it is these fertilizers in the nitrogen and phosphorus cycle that can wind up being harmful. Once again, they're needed. They're a good thing, but too much of a good thing, yeah, can be a bad thing. We're trying to stimulate growth in my plants in my yard, but if I'm not careful and I just put fertilizer out and then it rains that afternoon, a lot of that fertilizer just washes off into the drain, down into the creek. Well, when it gets to the creek, all that fertilizer is going to help producers grow, like algae. And all of a sudden the algae grows like crazy and I get an algal bloom. And the algal bloom gets so big, the bacteria come in to feed and they use up all the oxygen. And as the oxygen gets used up, then the fish die. So when we get these algal blooms, they can be very disastrous to an ecosystem. The fertilizer was designed to be on my yard, but if I'm not careful and it washes off into the drain, down into the lakes, then I get a euphotic system. There's too much nutrients in the water supply, algae grows too much, the bacteria are coming in to feed on it, and it depletes the oxygen. And in these ways, it winds up being a very bad thing. We will talk about this aspect of eutrophic lakes again and again, because all of our red tides, algal blooms, a lot of that is due to runoff, because you and I, and some of the farms, etc., it's excessive fertilizer going into the system. Too much of a good thing, yeah, makes a bad thing. All right, guys, that's it for the cycles. Make sure you're aware of them. You can identify the carbon from the nitrogen and the phosphorus. You know specifically how they work and the intricate little details. And we'll see you next time. Take care.